It's actually Amy Gonzalez, project manager of the Disability Employment Technical Assistance Center. And I'll be going over our agenda. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. What we want to do today is just give participants a really good understanding about Olmstead and the civil rights for people with disabilities. And we really want to ensure that we're providing a wonderful overview about how to leverage Olmstead to focus on placing the people we support in competitive integrated employment. We're also going to hear from the Washington State team how they worked together to leverage the legislative process to work with some of the state collaborators to ensure that sheltered work in 14C was completely phased out in Washington State. And then we're going to transition over to a remarkable panel of some self-advocates that we have from Washington State, from Rhode Island, and from Maryland. And we're going to take some time to hear from them. And as we transition over to that panel, I just asked you to open your minds and open your hearts. As we participated in a planning call last week, some of these memories from formerly being in a sheltered workshop were tough on some of these panelists. And we're just very thankful and happy that they are here with us today to share and to let us know about their experiences and how pivotal they are to shaping their lives, and especially as it pertains to employment and social economic status for people with disabilities. And after we hear from the panel that's going to be moderated by Serena Lowe, we are going to dive into questions, comments, and an interactive discussion. I just also realized that I failed to introduce myself, and I am Amy Gonzalez. I apologize for that. I am the project manager. I am a middle-aged Latinx woman wearing a pink button-down shirt and a shoulder-length hair. And I just would like to say that we are thrilled and just delighted to have you with us today. So with that, we are going to move to the next slide, please. And I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing one of our first speakers, who is Stephen Schwartz. He is the legal director and former executive director of the Center for Public Representation in Northampton, Massachusetts. Stephen has practiced disability and civil rights law since 1972. And he has extensive experience in litigating class action cases related to the reform and development of community services systems for persons with disabilities, as well as civil rights damage cases for institutionalized persons. Stephen is currently litigating 9 community integration cases across the country, and really serves as a mentor in providing litigation support and technical assistance to attorneys throughout the United States that are focusing on disability rights issues. And it is just a true pleasure and an honor to turn it over to Stephen. Take it away.
Thank you, Amy. My name is Stephen Schwartz. As Amy mentioned, I work at the Center for Public Representation. I'm an older white male. I have white hair, a white mustache, and I'm wearing a dark plaid shirt. Next slide. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about 2 topics. First, I want to give a little overview of what the ADA and Olmstead means for people in workshops and about segregated employment that is funded by state agencies. And second, I want to talk about the outcomes of 2 of the leading cases that have been brought challenging sheltered workshops in Oregon and Rhode Island. Next slide. So to start with, before 2011, when our firm filed the first case in Oregon, there never was a court that had applied the ADA to the area of employment. So the case Lane versus Brown in Oregon was the very first one to do that. And that judge rather courageously first decided that the ADA unequivocally applies to employment services, just like it does residential and voting services. Second, that sheltered workshops are undeniably segregated settings under the ADA because people who are in sheltered workshops are isolated and removed from the community and have little contact with uh, non-disabled peers except for the people who are paid to work with them. Third, the judge said that Olmstead prohibits the unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities in workshops. And by unnecessary segregation, that would mean anyone who doesn't want to be there, who isn't refusing to leave, is unnecessarily segregated in a workshop. And finally, Olmstead requires that the states modify their employment service systems so that they expand the opportunity to receive employment services in the most integrated setting. Next slide. There were some hesitations and some caveats to the judge's decision. And again, this is the only published court decision in the country so far to deal with the issue of um, sheltered workshops. But the judge noted that first, because of a rather obscure footnote in the Supreme Court's Olmstead opinion, that it does not require, Olmstead doesn't require states to modify employment services or um, uh, to address segregated employment services if they're not the ones who are funding it. So if there are sheltered workshops or sub-minimum wage programs that are exclusively funded by the federal government or that are privately funded, they would not be covered by Olmstead. Second, the court said that uh, because the state doesn't usually provide jobs, it provides services, that Olmstead does not require a state to actually guarantee people get a job. It does require, however, that people receive sufficient supported employment services that would allow them to obtain a job and to work in competitive integrated employment. So this distinction may be subtle to some folks. You don't have to ensure they get a job, but you have to make sure you get the services and supports that would allow them to get a job. Next slide. Um, Olmstead also has always included an exception. It has said that states are not required to provide integrated services if one of two conditions are met. The first condition is that if the integrated services are way more expensive than segregated services, states aren't required to spend a lot more money just to transfer from segregated to integrated. And the second exception was that they're not required to provide an entirely new service, something they never did before. Those two exceptions, which are called the fundamental alteration exception in Olmstead, don't really have much applicability to either the case in Oregon or Rhode Island or to employment services in any way. First, because sheltered workshops tend to be more expensive um, than integrated employment services, and especially once people get jobs and become more independent and become full participants in the community, the integrated options are substantially less expensive. And second, um, the as long as the state is providing any kind of employment services like sheltered workshops or supported employment, it wouldn't be a fundamental alteration to provide a different kind of employment services. So courts have generally looked at this and said, if Oregon, you're providing some kind of employment services, then you have to provide integrated employment services. And in most states, even most states that have lots and lots of people in sheltered workshops, they usually have some supported employment. So that exception to Olmstead called fundamental alteration is not going to really be very relevant to um, integrated employment. Next slide. Um, One last problem with Olmstead is it has this sort of obscure footnote that said that the ADA does not require states to provide a particular quality of care or a particular level of benefits. In other words, there isn't an ability to go to court and say that you're providing bad employment services or you're not providing enough employment services. However, in in Oregon, the judge rejected the applicability of that footnote and said that although Oregon can't be forced to apply a particular quality of care, there were outcomes that it would be required to reach. And those outcomes are generally expressed in terms of whether people are getting minimum wage or better, and whatever the commensurate wage is for the jobs that they hold compared to non-disabled people who are doing similar work. Second, the amount of hours they work is another outcome and not a quality of care. And third, the benefits that they receive, that is the um, uh, various kinds of vacations and insurance and other kind of personal benefits that individuals receive, non-disabled people receive at in their factory or at their retail store. Same benefits must be provided to individuals with disabilities. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, integration and individualization. And so the court in Lane made it clear that um, that problematic and footnote in Olmstead does not mean that we can't hold Oregon accountable for providing decent wages, sufficient hours, the same employment benefits that non-disabled people get, and integration, that is the actual work site, the actual opportunities that people have to use common areas, cafeterias, front doors, anything else like that. They have to be integrated and equal to that which is offered to their peers without disabilities. Next slide. So let me turn now. So those are the basic principles that came out of the Oregon case, and they now represent the basic legal principles that apply to all challenges to segregated employment in the courts, at least. In Oregon, as well as in Rhode Island, there were settlements. Right before trial in Oregon, after we had amassed a minor army of experts who were all going to testify why Oregon's system violated the ADA, same thing in Rhode Island, the two states settled. And the settlement agreements are now the roadmaps for other states if they're going to be sued, if they don't change their employment practices. So the settlement in the Oregon case, Lane versus Brown, includes specific numerical and quality outcomes, just those things that the state was worried about before. They agreed to numerical and quality outcomes that must be achieved over 7 years. One of the outcomes was they had to reduce the number of people in workshops. Second, they had to increase the number of people in competitive integrated employment, or what we all call CIE. Third, they had to expand employment services through the Voc Rehab Agency, as well as the DD agency in Oregon. They had to engage schools, stop mock sheltered workshops, which I'll explain in a minute, expand work experiences for young people in schools, and require early transition planning. They had to establish and implement competency standards for the staff. They had to transform sheltered workshop providers into supported employment providers. And finally, they had to create data and monitor their performance through a stakeholder group. Next slide. So let's see how those requirements in the Oregon case in Lane translated into practice. The next couple of slides try to show what was required and what happened. So in the workshops, the settlement agreement prohibited all new admissions to the workshops. After the day the settlement agreement was signed, no one has ever entered a sheltered workshop in Oregon. Second, it required the number of people in the workshops who had been there for some time to be reduced from 2,670 to 1,530, essentially a reduction of about 1,200 people. It required a commensurate reduction in the number of hours people were working in the workshops, and required that everyone in a workshop be given an opportunity to move to a community integrated employment setting and have a career development plan that assessed their interests, their preferences, and their skills, as well as what their challenges are that would be addressed with support. So what happened with those sheltered workshop outcomes? Actually, Oregon went substantially further than what the settlement agreement required. Because of the intersection of the settlement agreement, of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that Congress passed just literally months before the settlement agreement was signed. And because of the home and community-based settings rule that governs the integration of waiver services, Oregon decided to end all of its workshops. And so over the last 5 years, Oregon has closed every one of its workshops and transferred all 2,670 people into community integrated employment or other community opportunities. In addition, advocates in Oregon were able to convince their legislature to ban sub-minimum wage in any setting, regardless of funding. So even workshops that were supported by private funding, by family funding, by federal funding, now are banned in Oregon. Next slide. What about the outcomes that and the requirements for integrated employment? The settlement agreement said that the state must provide competitive integrated employment to a little over 1,100 people, and it must provide employment services to almost 5,000 people. And for anyone who is in any kind of employment services, including a sheltered workshop, they must have a goal of obtaining competitive integrated employment. They must have a career development plan that, as I mentioned, explores their interests, their preferences, and their skills. And Oregon was required to increase its rate, expand its services, modify its providers, and change its rules so that their entire system supported integrated employment. How about the outcomes? Well, Oregon met the numerical outcomes about numbers of people obtaining jobs and numbers of people getting services early. The number of people in supported employment increased from 400 to 1,600. The average number of hours that people worked in a week increased from 8 to 15, and most of the quality outcomes were met as well. Next slide. What about VR, the Voc Rehab Agency? Under the settlement agreement, VR provides job development and placement for most people. Half of all must receive an employment services and get a VR plan for employment. The state was required to set up a memorandum of agreement between VR, the DD agency, and schools, and it was required to ensure that VR counselors participate in IEP meetings and transition planning meetings for students in schools. Almost all of the numerical outcomes were met early for VR. Funding for employment opportunities for students has been substantially expanded. Most of the quality outcomes are being met, and all the intake, eligibility, and service policies of VR were revised so that there's an emphasis on outreach and integration for people with disabilities, as well as serving some of the more people with disabilities with the greatest challenges. So there was no ability anymore for VR to deny eligibility or refuse to provide services if you had a significant disability or a complex condition. Next slide. What about schools? The schools were required under the settlement agreement to stop any form of make-believe sheltered workshops that were operating at the schools. And there were many. There were students in various school systems that were in segregated laundry services, working for the sports teams, and so on. All of those have been banned. Transition planning now begins at age 14. And as I mentioned earlier, there must be coordination with VR. The school system in Oregon has dramatically shifted. They now begin transition planning at 14. They provide in-school as well as summer employment opportunities for most students who are interested. Next slide. And finally, some more general outcomes that go beyond the schools, VR, and the workshops. Oregon was required to set up a statewide training and technical assistance capacity so that every single staff person who provided employment services had been trained and had demonstrated their competency in integrated employment. There was a technical assistance entity from Washington State, WISE, that helped providers who were doing sheltered work transform to providers to do integrated supported employment services. There was a broad education and outreach program to be able to teach the general public, families, and all other stakeholders about what integrated employment meant, what CIE or competitive integrated employment could do for individuals, with a broad campaign called I Work, We Succeed. And if you look at all the light rail buses going through Portland, Oregon, you'll see advertisements for I Work, We Succeed. In addition, there's a broad social media strategy and public engagement so that all people in Oregon, not just people with disabilities and not just their families, understand what competitive integrated employment is and how important it is to people with disabilities. Next slide. So that's what's happened in Oregon. It's been a pretty significant transformation, going from 2,700 people in sheltered workshops to no one in sheltered workshops over a period of 5 years, and an expansion of a commensurate expansion of community integrated, competitive integrated employment. Similar successes are happening in Rhode Island, where a case that started focused on the city of Providence, Rhode Island, has shifted to include the whole state. That case, which is litigated by the Department of Justice, has, I think, achieved similar successes. So let me stop here and turn it back over to Amy, and so you can hear from the people who have really promoted some of that change on the ground in Rhode Island and in Washington. Thank you, Amy.
Oh, this is just excellent. Thank you so much, Stephen, for laying the foundation of Olmstead, for helping the audience understand the true foundation of helping individuals with disabilities to obtain and retain competitive integrated employment and just be part of their community. Next slide, please. So you heard about the foundation. Next up, we're going to have a team from Washington State to share their experiences on this journey that they went through to phase out 14C. Jeremy Norton-Paul is the Executive Director of the Washington State Developmental Disabilities Council, where he advocates with and for people with developmental disabilities and their family to make the system work better. Before becoming an executive director of the DCC, Jeremy was a state director of employment and day services for the Tennessee Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Next is Courtney Williams. She is currently the director of the director of the Community Employment Alliance. The Community Employment Alliance is a Washington state advocacy organization working to ensure that people with disabilities have the same community employment opportunities as all other citizens. As an individual who was formerly in supported employment, Courtney advocates for community acceptance and support of all people contributing and participating in society. Next, I'm going to introduce Ivanova Smith. Ivanova Smith was born in Latvia and spent the first 5.5 years in an institution there before immigrating to the United States. She is a person with an intellectual and developmental disability, married, and has a 2-year-old daughter and a 3-month-old. Ivanova is an activist and advocate for employment of people with disabilities. Her advocacy includes meeting and testifying before the Washington state legislature and frequently speaking in front of legislators and facilitating other presentations. Next up is John Lamus. John is a policy and systems change professional with 16 years in the IDD field. He lives in Spokane, Washington, and is currently the advocacy coordinator for At Work, who is a community rehabilitation provider in Washington State. John also works for the University of Washington Center for Human Development and Disability on their Eco-Autism project. He has experiences being formally paid sub-minimum wages and has worked tirelessly to end 14C in Washington State. So now I'm going to turn it over to our Washington State presenters. Take it away.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. As Amy said, my name is Jeremy Norton-Paul, and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington State Developmental Disabilities Council. I'm a white man in my mid-30s with clear framed glasses and brown hair parted to the side. And I'm really honored to be here today on this webinar, and I'm especially proud to be here with some fantastic colleagues and friends, Courtney, John, and Ivanova. And I'm going to just share a few thoughts from my perspective, and then I'm going to get out of the way because I really want you to hear more from the people who really led the push to end subminimum wages in Washington State. Next slide, please. The first thing I want to say is that I know collaboration is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, used very frequently. I'm a little biased, but I think that we are pretty awesome collaborators in our community in Washington State. As a quick example, I probably see John, Ivanova, and Courtney several times a week, every week, and sometimes it feels like they're part of the same organization, even though they're not. And I think that that's just an indication of just how closely we collaborate, that it feels like our separate organizations are really part of one bigger team. So I'm going to share just a few thoughts about collaboration and legislative advocacy in Washington State before I hand it over to John and Ivanova. So first, just like many developmental disabilities councils across the country, one of our top priorities is advocacy activities. We work really hard to change the system so that it works better for people. And there are a couple of main approaches we take to that. The first approach is the direct advocacy, where we as DD Council staff and council members are talking with legislators and educating them and talking with other members of the community to advocate for change. But another really important role that we play is creating an advocacy ecosystem, an environment where other individuals and other organizations that are not the DD Council, but are part of the same community can really thrive and advocate for what they want and need. And so we think of our role as the DD Councils to help create and sustain that ecosystem so that it can really thrive. And to do that, one of the things that we do is we establish strong, effective partnerships among individuals, organizations, and coalitions. So a couple of examples of that, we have a long-lasting, long-term program called the Advocacy Partnership Project. Many of the advocacy activities that you see coming out of Washington State are part of that advocacy partnership project that we have with the ARC of Washington State. And within that partnership, we've helped provide leadership to something called the Community Advocacy Coalition, of which John and Ivanova and Courtney are members. And that's really that ecosystem, that environment where people are coming together every single month, dozens of organizations and individuals committed to change, committed to advocacy. And we help play a leading role in that. And so we have lots of values and principles that we follow to make that successful. One is that it's always been really important to us to center the voices and perspectives of self-advocates and family members with lived experience. That's always been a value and a priority of ours. However, in the last couple of years, I think we've all seen a significant increase in what that actually looks like in practice. I think one of the silver linings from the pandemic and virtual engagement is that we've seen people participating in advocacy that never really had the chance to do that before, or faced such significant barriers to engaging in advocacy that they didn't. And so I think one of the outcomes is that we have more diverse advocates from more parts of the state engaging in really meaningful ways. And so I'm just really excited to see that and hear directly from people with the most lived experience. They are the experts. And as always, all of our policies, all of our actions, all of our programs are always rooted in self-determination, independence, inclusion, and equity. So we've got a pretty big ecosystem, a pretty diverse environment for ideas and innovation, but we do have some parameters and guardrails to make sure that everything we do is always going to achieve outcomes in alignment with those values, so we can make sure that we're always accomplishing something great together. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to John and Ivanova so they can talk more about how we actually eliminated subminimum wages here. But first, we have a special video. If you go to the next slide. Recently, Senator Patty Murray recorded a video clip to share at a recent Community Employment Alliance conference. And so if you can go ahead and click play, it's just a couple of minutes long.
Hello, everyone. This is Senator Patty Murray, and I'd like to congratulate the Community Employment Alliance for your incredible work to make sure that Washington State workers with disabilities earn equal pay for equal work. Subminimum wages for workers with disabilities is discrimination, plain and simple. But thanks to your leadership and self-advocates like John and Ivanova, this outdated and ableist policy will now be a thing of the past in Washington State. Of course, we can't stop here. We need one fair, livable wage for everyone across the country. That's why I will keep fighting in the Senate to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour and end sub-minimum wages for nationwide for tipped workers, for youth workers, and workers with disabilities. So thank you again for your work on this important issue, and know I will always be your partner in the Senate.
We sincerely appreciate Senator Murray's support. And with that, I'd like us to go to the next slide, and I will hand it over to John and
Hello, everyone.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. My name is John Lemus. I am a 36-year-old white male. I'm wearing glasses and a red shirt with a blue blazer. So when we started this effort in Washington State, we started off with House Bill 1706. And this bill ended up being hard fought, and we got it passed, but it wasn't what we really wanted. It only ended up applying to state agencies. So this past legislative session, we worked on Senate Bill 5284, which was sponsored by the amazing Senator Emily Randall. And we were able to work with both sides of the aisle to get that bill passed. And that included working with self-advocates to make sure that we did this bill properly. And Ivanova, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Hi, so I'm Ivanova Smith. I am the chair of Self Advocates and Leadership SAIL, and I have black hair, olive toned skin, and a blue shirt. And my background is of a person in a wheelchair, and it's actually a drawing that I drew myself. One of my virtual backgrounds, and we did a lot of great work trying to make sure that this bill was not rushed and that people got the time that they needed to transition into integrated employment. We wanted to make sure that nobody was going to just be kicked out of their job and not be given the help they need to get a job in a community. And so we put a 2-year phase-in period for this bill to make it so that people, agencies, and businesses had time to help people get into those community integrated jobs in the community. And we have a lot of agencies that are willing to support and help agencies make that transition. And we wanted to give those agencies that time. As the chair of SAIL, I spoke with our members about this important issue, and many of the members agreed that having that 2-year phase in time is a good idea, just so that nobody, there's no excuses made that, you know, people were left out, or this was rushed, or there wasn't enough time to transition people. That we did not want that, because we want people to keep the hours that they are working, and we don't want people to lose their hours. We don't want people to lose their jobs. We just want people to be paid equitably for their work. We want people's labor that they've worked hard for and they've shown the value in to be respected and be seen at the same labor as any other worker's labor. So that is our passion. And we want to make sure that everyone gets connected with benefits planners to make sure that everybody's benefits did not get messed up with. And we're working to do more legislation to make it so that those income caps that do try to become a barrier for people and having an equitable wage, that doesn't stop people from having an equitable wage, and that people get to work the hours that they want to work. We are very passionate about that front. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivanova. What Ivanova said is really important about collaboration That is the biggest reason why we were able to get this bill passed this session, was collaborating with self-advocates to be on board with the phase-out period. This also helped win us over with parents and state legislators. So sometimes having to make those friendly amendments across the aisle really is important to getting bills, especially bills around ending subminimum wage passed. So we are very excited to see this happen in Washington State and look forward to working on the federal bill. So with that, I will turn it back over to Amy, I think, or Jeremy.
Thank you, John. Jeremy and Washington State team, is there any other last comments that you wanted to make?
I would just like to say, so I'm Courtney Williams. I'm the director for the Community Employment Alliance. I'm a white female who's 33, wearing a white blazer, and I'm wearing glasses as well. The CEA, the Community Employment Alliance, Amy did a wonderful job explaining our role. And I just want to say that we would like to be a resource. We know that this, the ability to do this, it's not easy, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of emotional intelligence and strength. And so we are your allies. Please do not hesitate to reach out if this is something that you would like to do. We would like to be that resource for you. This year was critical. It was time to do it. And I firmly believe that because John and Ivanova, as members of CEA, led this effort, that is why it got passed. They did it so tactfully and diplomatically, and we walked the line and we walked both sides. And so thank you so much, John and Ivanova, for carrying it to the finish line.
I would just like to make a comment real quick. It's as being able to do this alongside John, I'm very honored, and to be able to be part of this historical moment for the people, for workers with disabilities. And it's just so important and vital that we did this together, and that we were very advocate about the working with the legislature and working with legislators and making sure that and I think what worked is we worked with both sides, and we tried to make it as bipartisan as possible, because we were really passionate about making sure that this is something that benefits everyone. It doesn't matter what your politics are. You are better by having equitable wages. Thank you.
So I guess I would just end on a note that people with disabilities deserve real work for real pay. And we are passionate about making that happen. 14C is an idea whose time that has come and that needs to end. And now that we've gotten this done in Washington State, the next step is just getting the Transformation to Competitive Employment Act. And I think as self-advocates and providers and parents all collaborate and come together, we may just be able to get that federal bill passed in the next year or two. So definitely appreciate the opportunity to get to work with Jeremy, Courtney, and Ivanova to get our bill done in Washington State this year.
Thank you so much to the Washington State team for providing us with an understanding of the process that you went through to ensure that 14C sub-minimum wage work was phased out in Washington State. Washington State has definitely been a trailblazer for quite a bit of the rest of the country. And the theme of the June webinar is collaboration. So we felt like it would be a wonderful opportunity to have the Washington State team here to demonstrate that collaboration when working with legislators and other very critical stakeholders needed to make those systems change efforts. So let's move right along. Next slide, please. We are transitioning over to our self-advocate panel, the stars of the show today. I have already introduced Ivanova Smith and John Lemus, so I'm going to introduce the additional two self-advocates that will be joining the panel today. The first individual that I am going to introduce is Sunny Sefarati, who has been a resident of Annapolis, Maryland since 1988. She is the co-founder of the nonprofit organization, The Musical Autist. She is an autistic self-advocate and mentor to others on the autism spectrum. Sunny is also an active member of the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council. She is also a performing pianist and vocalist who plays at local nursing home and assisted living facilities in addition to community events. Sunny was born in South Korea, completely blind, and was adopted by her family in the US at age 2. She was diagnosed with autism in 2001 and is a graduate of the Maryland School for the Blind. Sunny's support broker connected her to the Self-Directed Advocacy Network, and she has been attending meetings actively since August of 2018. And Sunny is very committed to helping other participants become active members in their community and make others aware of the positive impact that self-directed services has. Our next self-advocate is Stephen Pocelli. He has been working in the administrative field since 2013 as an administrative assistant for Automated Business Solutions, which is a local business in Rhode Island, which offers technology solutions and IT managed services. Stephen is responsible for a number of tasks, such as a lot of computer work, shredding, assisting others doing administrative work. He is currently on leave since the COVID, but plans to return, and that's something that we'll also hear about today. And we have the center's senior advisor, Dr. Serena Lowe, who's going to be moderating that panel of self-advocates. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Serena.
Thank you so much, Amy, and it is my pleasure and privilege to be part of this panel and to moderate it. We have 4 extraordinary human beings on this panel who I think bring such a realistic lens into the barriers that people with significant disabilities encounter in trying to engage in competitive integrated employment. And it's really inspiring to see where, despite those barriers, they've been able to overcome segregated employment and poor expectations and really go the full stretch of getting jobs and pursuing careers that they really love. So I'm going to propose a question for each of them. I also wanted to say that I want to encourage the panelists to turn on their videos so that people can see them. I am a white middle-aged woman in my 40s, and I have 30 blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black and sparkly pantsuit outfit, and I am in my makeshift office at home. I'm actually going to shut my screen off at this time so that we can give proper attention to the 4 panelists. But I just want to, I think I noticed that Sunny and, oh yeah, Sunny's up now. And I see Steve and Ivanova and John, so we're good to go. So our first question I'm going to pose is to Steve. Steve, I know you've had some really unique experiences in Rhode Island, and I'd like to hear a little bit about when you were in high school, whether or not anyone ever talked to you about what you wanted to do for work after school, and whether or not you got the opportunity to participate in internships or apprenticeships or any opportunity to develop skills that were important to getting a job after school.
introduce yourself first.
Well, I did attend North Providence High. I graduated in 1982. And it was a good experience. I was bullied a lot, you know, because I needed special ed and I took the special ed bus. But it was a good experience. At the end of my high school graduation, I got a standing ovation from my classmates. And I didn't think I had friends, but I do. After that, I knew I had a lot of good friends. But it was a good experience. I went through grade 1 through grade 12. And I did have some internships at Ace Hardware, which was in North Providence. I worked there for the summer months, and I got paid. And I also did some janitorial work at North Providence High and Wayland School and Elementary School in North Providence. And then I went to Vocational Resources in North Providence, which I don't know if it's still there. And then through the CETA program, which gave me those jobs at the Hardware and Wayland Elementary School, I went to training through placement, which is now Easter Seals, and I was there for 30 years, and I'll talk more about that later.
Describe yourself.
I am a white male. I have a white shirt on and brown hair. And yeah. And I'm from North Providence, Rhode Island, and a member of the Rhode Island Developmental Disabilities Council. And I am a lecturer at St. Anthony's Church in North Providence. I am also a member of the Holy Name Society, which is a men's group in the parish.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. Steve, a lot of those opportunities sound like they might have given you some experience, but were pretty segregated. How did that make you feel? And did anyone ever talk to you about jobs that were in the community?
Well, while I was in the workshop, when I had my ISP meeting, they did say I was going to get competitive employment. They kept saying that every year, but then nothing ever happened yet, you know. So I was at the workshop for 30 years. But then in 2013, you know, the Justice Department got involved, and the creed got signed and everything. Most of my friends and I got jobs. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful to know. Sunny, I want to turn to you. I know that you spent several years in a sheltered workshop, despite sharing with people your interest in moving on to work in the community. And I would like to hear a bit from you about your experiences and frustrations with that, and what it was like to work in the sheltered workshop, and how your supervisors and others treated you.
Well,
This is for Sunny.
Well, hello. I just want to let everyone know that we are experiencing a thunderstorm here. So if my internet goes out, you'll know why. My name is Sunny Sefarati. I am an Asian female with black hair that runs between my chin and my shoulders. I am wearing a polo shirt and a blue jean skirt. And what color socks do I have on, Lauren?
They can only see your shirt, so it's less relevant.
Yeah, so I'm wearing a polo shirt and a blue jean skirt.
Black socks.
And I'm wearing black socks. So so to answer your question, Serena, you know, I could go on and on about this. You know, unfortunately, my school, I graduated from Maryland School for the Blind in 2007, as my bio said. Unfortunately, I did not have a choice of where to go. And as I said in the preparation call last week, I was part of a broken system, which basically meant I had to be placed in a shelter workshop. And I was there for 8 years. I got paid sub-minimum wage. I left the shelter workshop in 2015 because my support broker, CJ Shiloh, encouraged me to enter into self-directed services. I was very frustrated at the shelter workshop. And this is a powerful message for the audience because this is where a lot of people have been placed, you know, before we started phasing out 14C. This was where a lot of people were placed. A lot of people with disabilities were placed. And there was more negative aspect of the shelter workshop than positive. I would say really the only positive thing that happened was I was in the handbell choir and I sang as a vocalist for the handbell choir. But other than that, you know, I was unable to walk around. They would not let me walk around the facility independently because they didn't want to be liable in case I got injured because a client was having challenging behavior. Now, my first couple years in the shelter workshop, I had to deal with my belongings being broken by a young lady who had severe challenging behaviors. And if I had, you know, these devices that I have now in 2007, they would have probably all been broken by now, and they're not cheap to replace. But sorry, my iPad was talking. Somebody said something in the chat. Yeah, so it was really frustrating being in the shelter workshop. The last paycheck I got there was like $2 and some change. A lot of times I would be sitting around in the workshop waiting for work to come. And a lot of times work did not come. We just sat around. I didn't get exercise. I did not set my own goals. I basically worked at the mercy of somebody else. And that was frustrating. But now with self-direction, I set my own goals. I hire my own staff. I decide where to go and what to do every day.
Sunny, that is excellent. And it really emotionally made me angry for you, hearing the struggles and obstacles that you faced in the sheltered workshop. But it's pretty amazing what the life that you've been able to create for yourself since going into self-direction. So thank you for sharing your perspective and your experience. I'd now like to pose a question to Ivanova, and this is really about your transition from segregated work into the community. So what made you want to look for a job outside of the workshop? And did anyone ever tell you that you could work somewhere else? Or did you ever tell anyone that you wanted to work somewhere else? And if so, what was their reaction?
Yes, so this is Ivanova, and my first job, I was stuck there for a whole year, and I remember trying to talk to my employment counselor and tell them that this job wasn't working, that there was a lot of abuse. So I was getting verbally abused in the job, and I also was getting pushed, like people were literally pushing me, and like during my breaks, I would get restrained from rocking. And it made me really scared, and I didn't think I could work. I didn't think that because all they could offer me was this type of job. I did not have the confidence and to know my rights back then. And when my mom is the one who helped me get out of that job, and she helped me get into university. And I learned about the disability civil rights movement and the history and why I was getting abused in a job like that. And so that's what fueled my passion to get into advocacy work. And so that's actually what started me getting involved doing work around workers' rights for disabilities. I became an intern for the Arc of King County, and I became more aware of segregated employment and sub minimum wage, and I gave a speech about my experience, and also talked about ending sub minimum wage, and that's how I got connected with At Work. And when I gave that speech, they were there and they had the picket signs saying, end sub minimum wage, because they had just ended the sheltered workshops and they were really excited about it. And they're wanting to get more involved with the self-advocacy movement. And they're very excited. And I met with them and I spoke at the breakfast. I gave a speech, and then the executive director, Chris Brent, hired me and said, I want to hire you to do advocacy work because you have a lot of passion in it. And we became friends. And so she's not just my boss, she's my friend too. She's a good colleague, and I really like working there. And it's been really awesome getting to work at a place that's inclusive, and like my coworkers are people with disabilities, people without disabilities. And it's the same way at the land. I became part of the land through being an intern at the Arc of King County. They helped me get involved with the land leadership, education, and their developmental disabilities. And those are the two jobs I work, and I absolutely love those jobs. And I love the natural supports that I have in those jobs. And I think that people shouldn't have to feel like they have to be a segregated work to feel like they're in a safe work environment. I was scared to go into work for a long time after I had that first job experience. Like when I first got out of the job, I never wanted to work again. And it's not until I met people that I realized not employers are like that there are good employers out there that care about their employees, that support their employees, and that are that got their employees' backs. And that's something that's so important.
It is. And Ivanova, there were so many nuggets of important information that you shared. First was the critical role that family support and engagement makes in having high expectations of your loved ones to pursue competitive integrated employment. I think the other one that I heard was the support of employers and finding not only a good fit in terms of your skills, preferences, and strengths and goals, but also finding employers that really match that. And then I think what I heard was the power of having access to self-determination training and learning how to advocate for yourself and really understanding your rights as an individual with disabilities. So thank you for your perspective. Those were excellent comments. I'm now going to check in with John because I have a question for John. John, I'd like to know whether or not when you were transitioning to competitive integrated employment, were there people like a case manager or a transition counselor or a VR counselor or a Center for Independent Living that helped you get a paid job? And who was it that helped you in terms of supporting your employment goals?
So I would say my first job was while I was still in high school, and it was working on an Ability One contract, pulling weeds at a local Air Force base. And my first paycheck from that job was about $70, and I really couldn't understand why it was so low. My sisters were older adults and they had worked all their teenage years and they always made minimum wage. So that was a kind of a crux point for me of like, why is this okay? I had very mixed experiences with DVR here in Washington State. My goal was to work in disability advocacy, and oftentimes the employment providers who were working with me said that if that's all I wanted to do, I didn't really want to work because I wasn't willing to take other jobs. And so that was very frustrating. I knew what I was good at, and it took me a very long time to find my first full-time job in our field. I started out through the AmeriCorps program, was with our local ARC for about 3 years, transitioned over to another organization. After their CEO heard me talking at a conference, I was invited to speak at a CEA conference, and the CEO of the organization was there, and hearing me talk badly about his organization that paid me $70 for that first paycheck. And shortly after that, they offered me a full-time position with their organization running community relations. I stayed there for about 4 years. When I left, I approached DVR, and they weren't really able to find me a job. All of the jobs that I've found, even with DVR support, have just kind of been through my own connections. So after leaving that last job, I was brought on to a congressional campaign. Many of you probably have heard of Lisa Brown. She's a former Washington State Senator. And that was an incredible experience, just gaining that work experience. And then before leaving the congressional campaign, on the day that we were cleaning out our office, the regional director for At Work called me and said, "Hey, we want you to come work for us doing advocacy." And that's my dream job. And I said yes. And I've been with the company for about 2 years now and was able to work up to full time, making more than minimum wage. So that was very amazing to be able to have that opportunity after working so hard. But again, the support agencies like DVR, they don't know how to think outside the box. You know, oftentimes when people go to them for services, it either ends up just being a generic plan for materials handler or food service. And I think that DVR counselors or VR counselors need to learn to think outside of those boxes and see people for the strengths and abilities that they have and what they can bring to a table.
Excellent, yeah. John, that was really helpful. And I think, number one, I just want to acknowledge how hard you've worked to create a career for yourself. And it sounds like you really had to rely on yourself quite a bit and some natural supports. And I also, what I picked up on in your comments was that systems that are so rigid can't really individualize their thinking about, you know, an individual person and what their interests and needs might be. And that really doesn't help anyone. So thank you for sharing that. I'm gonna turn back, I think, to, I'll leave this question for the group. And if I can just have 1 or 2 of you comment on it, I would appreciate it. I'd really like to hear your description based on your experiences, on what the differences are between segregated employment and competitive integrated employment. Steve, would you like to start?
Okay, training through placement was what the name of the agency where I worked. It was only people with disabilities working there, and we got paid way less than the minimum wage. We didn't get to leave or meet people outside of the agency unless we went like to a dance or something or whatever. That was segregated. But it was a good, it was a good experience. I did make a lot of good friends there, and I also met my girlfriend who is now deceased. It was a very special relationship, and that's one of the reasons why I'm glad I went there. So I met her there, and we had a good friendship for 10 years. So that was one of the good things that happened there. And we had a consent decree in Rhode Island in 2013, and training to replacement was closed, and FedCap, which was another agency, came and got me and a few of my friends jobs right away. And I started working in an office, working with people that didn't have a disability, and it was very interesting to talk to them, and they're all good people. Like I said, I have been out because of COVID, hopefully get back soon. And or maybe another job, not sure yet, but I got paid minimum wage. So I was part of the office team, and it felt good about myself that is integrated employment. And I knew I could do it, and I just needed a chance.
Excellent. Ivanova, did you want to share kind of your experiences in terms of the differences between working in the community compared to your time working in the sheltered workshop?
Well,
so I want to clarify something. I was not in a sheltered workshop. I was in a segregated environment, but it was not some minimum wage. It was not C14. It was an Ability One contract, but it was segregated work. It was like group work. Being a kitchen aide.
We're getting a little bit of background, so if you're on mute or not muted as a presenter and could mute yourself until it's your turn to speak, we'd be very grateful. And thank you for clarifying that, Ivanova, that you were in segregated employment, but it was an Ability One contract that was not a sheltered workshop per se. So Ivanova, I think, is busy being a mom too, which I think all of us working moms can really relate to, especially.
Yeah, I had to change my daughter real quick, so I will have to disappear for a moment. Sorry about that.
We totally understand. Family and children come first. So I'm just going to wrap it up with one last question for both Sunny and John. It'd be great to know, in your experience, why it's important for all people with disabilities to have the opportunity to try competitive employment, engage in competitive integrated employment. And what type of advice would you give to people who have a responsibility, professional responsibility, to help youth and adults with significant disabilities pursue employment?
Well, I can start because I can really speak on this, and I'll give John a turn after. You know, my advice that I would give to transitioning youth, to those, the reason, one of the big reasons I think why people were placed in a sheltered workshop is, as I said before, because the system is broken. I also want to add that schools and families believe that shelter workshops is the best place for their child or for their student to go, because the parent oftentimes needs to take their quote unquote child somewhere so that they can go to work during the day. You know, once we age out of the school system, a lot of us don't have a choice as to where we go. And so my advice to VR counselors, like John said earlier, think outside the box. Don't default to the shelter workshop setting, especially if you have a child or a student who is sorry, my iPad was talking. We have to realize that our children or our students who are perfectly capable of working in the community do not, and I repeat, do not need to go in a shelter workshop. It's not the place for us. So I think that people need to they need to look at our options. My best advice would be look at your options, weigh your options. Don't default to the shelter workshop, especially if you have a child or a student who is perfectly capable of working in the community, of being a part of the community. You know, the main difference between working in a shelter workshop and working in like places like self-direction and integrated employment is you make the decisions on who to hire. You make the decisions on where to go, what to do. You set your own goals. In the shelter workshop, you didn't have that option.
Good point, Sunny. And John, what's your advice to professionals that are working with individuals with disabilities regarding employment?
So I want to make a couple comments on that question. The first is what Sunny talked about is, you know, educators really needing to have higher expectations. You know, you often hear about the school to prison pipeline. In our field, we have the school to workshop pipeline. And the small rural school that I went to was in Cheney, Washington, and I went there for 2 years. And that is where they sent all of their graduates every year, was to the sheltered workshop. And that is unacceptable. And that was in what, 2002. You know, we're supposed to be farther along than that. So I really think that it starts with the educators having higher expectations and really making sure that they're teaching on things during those last few transition school years that are going to help their students gain some marketable job skills, and not just doing volunteer internships at the food bank, which is or washing the school tables for free after lunch, but really actually providing some tangible experiences. My last 2 years of high school, I had to go out that summer and develop the job that I wanted for that school year. And I came back and I was 18 and I said, here's what I've set up for you. Please make the connections with the administrator and set it all up and make sure the paperwork's in order. This is what I will be doing this year. And so I think that it's just really those educators. And then the advice that I would give to the frontline professionals in our field who are doing the job coaching and the job development, as well as the VR counselors. And it starts with the VR counselors because that's where the coaches and developers take their contract directions from, is just really being open to what the individual wants to do. and really being able to have like person-centered discussions and focus on, okay, here are the tasks, really just customizing a job. And moving towards what people want to do and what they're good at. One of the other things that I want to make mention of is that we really need more opportunities for tangible training. A lot of individuals that have disabilities are looking for jobs in artisan careers like baking or coffee. My favorite example of social enterprise is Biddy and Bo's Coffee. They are amazing. And those are the kind of things that we need, are things that are going to provide individuals with disabilities with tangible training opportunities so that they can go out and seek those jobs and be successful and make minimum wage or higher in their community. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John. What a great way to end this panel. I want to thank all four self-advocates and self-advocate leaders, because they are leaders in their communities. Thank you, Sunny, Steve, Ivanova, and John for sharing your personal experiences, your expertise, and your perspective about what needs to happen in the future. Such a wonderful panel, and I'm so grateful to have each of you here today. I'm now going to turn it over to Amy Gonzalez again, who is going to field questions from the chat and Q&A box. If you haven't had a chance to put your burning questions in, please do. And we'll try to get through as many of them as we can in the last 8 to 10 minutes of today's webinar. So Amy?
Thank you, Serena, and to our wonderful presenters. We got this question right after Sunny presented. This question is from Willard Watkins. Sunny, you made $2 and change for how many days of work?
I made $2 and some change for 2 weeks worth of work. Yeah, pathetic, isn't it? It's like sub minimum wage in a nutshell. $2 and some change for 2 weeks worth of work. It was like a slap in the face. My support broker, CJ Shiloh, who was actually upstairs, she saw that paycheck. She's like, Sunny, that was a slap in the face.
Thank you, Sunny, for answering that. I'm going to share a really strong comment that Andrea made. And I think that this is extremely telling in terms of direct service or indirect services that we're providing as grantees and other professionals in the field. Thank you so much to the panelists and self-advocates for sharing your experiences and how you felt about it at that time. I'm now a disabilities advocate in North Dakota, but my background prior to this was a program coordinator for a DD provider. I'm so sad to look back and understand now that at the time I may have contributed to people feeling this way in arranging for them to work in a specific sheltered workshop setting prior to seeking competitive integrated employment at a future time. I just want to say that from my heart, if I knew better, I would have done better. And thank you for helping me understand. And I just want to be clear in sharing that same message to other people that are on this webinar right now. Those of you maybe who can impact someone's life directly or indirectly, to really think about these powerful stories that you've heard today, to remember these experiences when you maybe even think about referring somebody to some form of segregated setting. I'm just kind of going through comments right now. There is a ton of kudos. People are inspired by your stories. John and Ivanova and Steve and Sunny, they're feeling pumped and really inspired to help other individuals get to competitive integrated employment. Let me see. Inspirational panel. Thank you for sharing your experiences and insights.
And
And
Amy, I
just,
think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box too.
yes, we do. Thank you. So we have a question coming in from Robert Jackson. Are sheltered workshops a thing of the past in Oregon, Washington, and Rhode Island? Why don't we turn that over to Steve Schwartz?
Thanks, Amy. They are definitely a thing of the past in Oregon, and it sounds like they are also a thing of the past in Washington. There are several other states that I know have passed statutes that are similar to what has happened in Oregon and Washington. I think that includes New Hampshire and Maryland. Amy may know better, but there's an increasing number of states that are banning sheltered workshops, that are saying no more sub-minimum wage. Even if the federal law allows it, we're not going to allow it locally. I don't actually know whether Rhode Island has banned sheltered workshops. I know that they have significantly reduced the number of people in the workshops, but I'm not sure about the ban. So to answer the question, it's actually more than just Oregon and Washington. I think there's now between 5 and 10 states that are lining up to prohibit sheltered workshops from now and forever.
And yes, Rhode Island has closed our sheltered workshops.
Yeah.
Ivanova has something to say. Go for it, Ivanova.
Hi, so this is Ivanova, and I just wanted to say what I wasn't able to say earlier about segregation. Like segregate between. I think that segregation should only happen for like when the person is for like social events, like community events and things like that. But I don't think we should have segregation in employment. But if we do have segregation in employment, I think the people who are the leaders, who are the bosses, should also be people of that community and not be not of that community. That's the only way I would think segregation could work well. But segregation where you have non-disabled people being the lead and having the power, that causes a power imbalance that's unhealthy. And so I would say for community, I think everybody should get community integrated employment. And the only segregated employment would be like a small business that's owned by a person with IDD and they're hiring other people with IDD kind of thing. But other than that, we should be fully included and nobody should have to be segregated because it just puts a target on our back when we're segregated. I think people get bullied more being segregated than non-segregated, and that's been my experience. Thank you.
Amy, this is Courtney. I apologize. My camera is not working for some reason. However, could I expand a little bit on the question regarding
Yes,
sheltered work?
Courtney, please expand upon it, and then we'll move right along to center updates. Go for it.
Perfect. So there are no sheltered workshops in Washington State. There are still 14C certificate holders, and that means less than 270 individuals in Washington State are being paid sub-minimum wage, which is monumental. It used to be significantly higher, and we've slowly been phasing it out. However, as of now, it is eliminated officially with a 2-year transition period in the bill that we helped draft. And I want to say there was a comment made about concerns with individuals maybe hitting a wall in that transition period. That was a big deal for us as well, the Community Employment Alliance. And all I can say is rely on the tools in your tool belt. There are so many organizations, especially within CEA, that have transitioned out and have relied on fellow members, and we are willing to be supportive to others as well. We want to see this pass at the national level, and we don't just hit Washington territory. We're happy to expand our borders.
Thank you, Courtney. So let's wrap up right now. We had some rich questions and comments. One specific attendee is asking for a round 2 of this panel for a deeper dive into learning about your experiences, which I think is an excellent suggestion. Next slide, please. Really quick, I'm going to give center updates. So we just like to remind you that for the next week or so, we still have the environmental landscape report and 5-year strategic plan up on our site newsroom. If you would like to provide any feedback, please check it out. Next slide, please. And we really just want to thank you for being here today. Our upcoming webinar next month will be reflecting on the ADA in terms of technological support solutions in a COVID world. So we hope to see you there. Next slide, please. And just a friendly reminder that if you would like to talk through a challenge, if you would like to hear more from our speakers today, we do have virtual office hours this Friday from 12 to 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. Feel free to dial in, and we look forward to chatting with you and further diving into some of those challenges that you're experiencing. Next slide. We'd also like to remind you that if you need technical assistance or training, to please reach out to us so that we can work through that need. We're happy to meet your needs here at the Training and Technical Assistance. Next slide. This is just our contact information. Thank you so much for being here with us today.